Hi Year 12, just a short one from me today going over 4 sources that I set you just before we broke up for half term, thinking about Cromwell's actions in Ireland and whether or not we can deem them to be excessively brutal. So I sent you 4 sources that were completely blank and I asked you to annotate them, but then I also sent you a paragraph that I had typed up in relation to source A, so hopefully you've read that as well. So I'm just going to go through my notes and I want you to compare them to yours. If you didn't make the notes when I set them a week or so ago, then obviously use my points now to please add to them. I'm not setting a 30-mark question for these sources this time, but I will be setting you another 30-mark question in probably a couple of weeks or so. So first off, source A, this came with a little paragraph from me as well, which I've used pretty much to just kind of annotate this source as well. So some of this stuff should be you should be familiar with because you should hopefully have read the paragraph already. So source A, it is an act for the abolishing of kingly office in England and Ireland, and for the dominions thereunto belonging. It was published on the 17th of March 1649 under an Act of Parliament. So this was presented by the Rump Parliament in order to set out rules and new legislation that effectively made Ireland a state of which would no longer have a monarchy. Similar in the way in which the Rump, just before the execution of Charles, passed several acts which aggrandised their own positions and effectively made the rule of the monarchy and the rule of the House of Lords irrelevant so that they could rule of their own. And this is pretty much doing the same thing, but it's just enforcing it upon Ireland. So the source is written in 1649. This is after the execution of Charles from January of the same year. So this is written posthumously from Charles's perspective, and it's just kind of setting out the laws of the land and how the Rump wants Ireland to be governed now that there isn't a king. So the source is establishing the new rules of Ireland. Now there is a lack of king to rule over it, and after the execution of Charles, Ireland becomes somewhat unruly and rather rebellious. Ireland had always been, I've said this before, considered to be a thorn in the side of British monarchs who found it quite difficult to govern. We know that Charles did in his early years. He sent Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, over there to sort Ireland out. And this is no different. So now that Charles has been removed, members of the Irish community, not just Catholics and Protestants, they actually come together to fight on one side for a period of time, push back against the authority of the Rump. So this source was written before Cromwell's expedition to Ireland in August. That's important. Cromwell isn't there yet, so he hasn't done anything at this point. So it's written without hindsight of the controversial events that are about to come shortly afterwards. That is important because it means that this source gives us a pretty good understanding of how the Rump wanted Ireland to be governed, how they kind of envisioned the governing of Ireland to work. Therefore, we can then compare what they are saying here on the 17th of March to what actually happened when Cromwell was sent there by the Rump in sort of August, September time, and that'll help us to determine whether he was excessively brutal or not. So it's quite a long source. You wouldn't generally, in your actual exam, you wouldn't tend to get a source as long as this, but I do kind of like to find as many different sources as I can. They would probably crop it so you wouldn't get the full thing, but it doesn't matter. The main sort of theme or body of this source tends to be pushing the idea that Parliament in Ireland should not be governed by one person, or it should not reside by one person. That if that does happen, that power of Ireland is given to a single person, they deem it to be unnecessary, burdensome, dangerous to the liberty, the safety and the public of interest of the people. That regal power has in the past been used to oppress, impoverish and enslave the subjects of Ireland. So it's quite strong in tone in terms of what it doesn't want to happen in Ireland. Doesn't want one person to, as a single body, dominate and govern Ireland. They're obviously saying this from the perspective of a king, that when Charles acted alone as a singular figure, he would often use his power to abuse his position, that would sometimes mean that the people of Ireland would feel enslaved, or that Charles would sometimes use his power to oppress his Irish subjects. So it's saying that it wants to avoid that. It doesn't want one person to govern Ireland. It wants Ireland to be governed by a parliamentary body of lots of different people. However, that's all very fine and well them saying that, but we do actually know from our own historical knowledge of this period that when they commissioned Cromwell to become Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, that he did often act as a singular person when he arrived there. And similarly, as I've typed up over here, Cromwell did rule over Ireland as a single person, often taking it upon himself to act as judge, jury and executioner after the Rump appointed him as Lord Lieutenant and ordered him to crush Irish insurgency. We know that Cromwell acted as a singular person because he made all major military decisions whilst in Ireland, most of which were excessively brutal, that he then had to justify his actions later on because they were deemed as being excessive. I think the source goes on to support the statement quite strongly that Cromwell did act excessively brutal in Ireland, as all the way throughout the source it continually stresses the importance of freedom and liberty of Ireland. It states that it's dangerous, unnecessary and burdensome to have the power in any one singular person, but we know that Cromwell does actually go ahead and he does do that. However, to bring in a slight counter argument, you could also suggest that it's actually Parliament's fault for Cromwell's actions, because they were the ones that commissioned him to go there. They gave him the orders to do what he did to some extent. But again, as a counter argument for that, we know that when Cromwell was ordered to report back his actions in particular areas in Ireland, such as Drogheda and Wexford, that Cromwell would often bend the truth in his reports and his letters. For example, he would often downplay the amount of civilian casualties, or he would maybe bend the truth about some areas surrendering or not surrendering. Therefore, this perhaps suggests that Cromwell knew that his brutality would not be accepted. He took it upon himself to decide what was right and what was wrong during his expedition. So again, that to me does suggest that source A strongly supports a statement that Cromwell was excessively brutal in Ireland, because that is not what the Rump sent him there to do when looking at the content of this source. They had not sent him to Ireland by this point, but they had originally planned for for Ireland not to be governed by one independent person. They wanted Ireland to have a relative degree of freedom, but to fall under the lines of the parliamentary body of the Rump, not one person, that was Cromwell. So source A agrees. Next one, in contrast, slightly different one. Source B is a letter written by Cromwell. That's meant to say is, not just I. Put an I in there. Here he is giving his account of the events at Wexford, and I've just put a little box here which I've taken from your knowledge organiser if you get the two confused. So the events at Drogheda happened first in September 1649. Cromwell's troops massacred nearly 3,500 people, including 2,700 royalist soldiers, all the men in the town with weapons, and also civilians, prisoners and unarmed priests. And then Wexford happened later in October of the same year, where Cromwell slaughtered 2,000 Irish soldiers, and perhaps, again using that term perhaps because it is an estimate, we aren't entirely sure, of around 1,500 civilians also killed. So this is the second of the two of the most controversial expeditions that Cromwell took part in. This is, as I've just said, a letter written by Cromwell. It was then presented to the Speaker of the House, who then recounted Cromwell's account of what happened during the massacre of Wexford. So what you've got to bear in mind is that Cromwell is writing this letter knowing that it is going to be presented to Parliament. He's explaining his behaviour knowing that he is being criticised by some. So obviously he's got to keep that in mind with the way in which he is writing his account. He knows that he's going to be criticised for what he's done. So he goes on to say, "We were intending to better this place," obviously this place meaning Wexford, "that so great a ruin, hoping the town might be of more use to you." So as I've said before, since the execution of Charles and the lack of monarchical rule, certain areas in Ireland had become unruly and rather rebellious. The use of his term "to better this place," hoping the town might be of more use to you, Cromwell is justifying his actions by explaining that actually he was following orders from the Rump. The Rump sent him to Ireland in order to crush Irish insurgency. So he's saying, I'm here because we're here to better this place. We were here to crush those that weren't following your orders in the hope that eventually this town might become more used to you. So he's almost setting his stall out for sort of saying, you know, I've actually done what you sent me here to do. But his tone changes quite quickly. Straight away, he doesn't even get through a full sentence. He brings God into his explanation, which isn't overly shocking. We know that Cromwell was a God-fearing man, and that everything he did, he believed that it was in God's plan, that it was following God's providence, a sort of divine intervention, that nothing happens by coincidence. Everything that Cromwell did was for God because God wanted him to do it. So he goes on to say, yet God would not have it so, but by an unexpected providence, his righteous justice brought a just judgment upon them. So he's quick to mention that actually, at the start, he's saying, I was following the orders of the Rump, but quite quickly, by an unexpected providence, by almost like a shocking turn of events, God then gets involved, and that actually he is given orders from a higher power. It's a different plan now. He's no longer following just the rules of the Rump. He's now following the rules from God directly. And he then goes on to say, where's it gone? His righteous justice brought a just judgment upon them. That's quite a mouthful to say, actually. What he means by that is, I think we've maybe discussed this briefly before in school, that Christians obviously don't believe in violence. It goes against the Bible, one of the 10 Commandments about murder, thou shalt not kill, that sort of thing. But in the eye of a Christian, you can participate in war if it is for a just cause. So even though traditional Christians would be almost pacifistic in nature, in that they don't agree in violence, if they were to argue that it was for a just cause, then that in their mind makes it okay. So he's saying that actually, because of God's intervention, his actions in Wexford were just what he did. And he then almost goes on to kind of explain why it is that they were just. So he brought a just judgment upon them, causing them to become prey to the soldier. And that term there, if you're prey to a soldier, that's almost talking about civilians, really. It's not talking about other soldiers. If you're a prey, you've been sort of hunted down by someone who's stronger or better than you, someone who's armed and you're not armed. But he's saying that that was okay in his mind, that's justified, because actually these people who by their piracies had made a prey of so many families and made with their bloods to answer the cruelties by which they had exercised upon the lives of various poor Protestants. So he's saying, he's not denying the fact that his soldiers killed civilians. He's not saying that that's not true. He's saying it's true, but it's justified, it's okay, because actually what these people have done in the past against poor Protestants has been much worse. Therefore, they deserved to be slaughtered by his soldiers as almost kind of like an act of vengeance upon what had happened previously. He says that it's a just judgment. He doesn't think he's done anything wrong in Wexford. And that bit here where it talks about exercise upon the lives of various poor Protestants, this goes all the way back to, if you can remember, when we were looking at the road to the English Civil War with sort of Charles versus Pym, when when John Pym was acting quite skillfully to rally support onto his side, he would often spread anti-Catholic propaganda, and he did this quite cleverly to scaremonger against Catholics, particularly in Ireland, and he picked up upon stories of Irish Catholics murdering Protestants, horror stories of women, Protestant women in Ireland being drowned in lakes, pregnant women being sort of stabbed in the stomach, babies being slaughtered. He picked on sort of the really heart-wrenching, sort of gut-churning stories that really fueled this passionate hatred of Irish Catholics. But that's going back to sort of the early 1640s, really, before the outbreak of the English Civil War. So that's almost 10 years ago now, by the time we're getting into 1649. And Cromwell is still playing upon that Catholic propaganda that was used by John Pym almost a decade ago. So I think you could kind of see this as... Cromwell has maybe gone to Ireland under the orders of the Rump, but he's actually gone with another agenda. He's gone with the idea that he needs to take part in some sort of racial cleansing of Ireland, particularly of Irish Protestants that had wronged Irish Catholics, that had wronged Irish Protestants in the build-up to the English Civil War. Thus it has pleased God to give into your hands this other mercy, for which, as for all, we pray God may have all the glory. Indeed, your instruments are poor and weak and can do nothing but through believing, and that is the gift of God also. Essentially saying that whilst the orders of the Rump are important, the orders of God are more important, and that this is a gift from God, the slaughtering of these Irish Catholics. So obviously Cromwell doesn't believe that he was excessively brutal. So this source doesn't agree with the statement. He believes that he acted in accordance to God's providence and that that was the right thing to do. But you've got to also remember that the reason why it doesn't agree is because it was written by Cromwell. So it's heavily biased in terms of the accounts of what he's done, because he's justifying what he's done. But also he's saying this because it has a very strong religious tone to it. Next one, D. So this matches some elements of the previous source in that, again, this is another letter from Cromwell this is now talking about his actions in Drogheda. So this actually happened first. So source D technically comes before the previous source. But although it's the same in terms of it's a letter by Cromwell about what he's done, and again it is being sent to the Rump for them to formally discuss, it is quite different in its tone, you should notice. So he talks here, I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God on these barbarous wretches. So again, Cromwell is quick to mention God and providence and the idea that he is acting upon a righteous judgment, that God has given him these instructions and he is dutifully following them through. He believes that's the right thing to do, but his language is slightly different here than it was in the previous source. He talks poorly in source B about the fact that Irish Catholics had embarked on cruelties against various poor Protestants, but he doesn't use as strong a language as he does here. So he says, righteous judgment of God on these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands with so much innocent blood. So he's speaking with much more of an emotive tone than he had done in the previous source. He's speaking about the Irish as being almost like barbarians. If you're a barbarian, you don't follow common law, you act of your own. You sort of, if you think of someone as being a barbarian, they are much lower in class. They sort of follow their own rules. They're seen as being sort of dangerous and untrustworthy, and also to call them wretches as well is quite a strong word of the time. If you're a wretch, it implies that you're an awful, horrible person who has no morals, you only think of yourself, that kind of thing. And again, it says that these people have so much innocent blood on their hands. Again, that innocent blood is talking about the Protestant blood that was spilt in the lead up to the English Civil War, where Irish Protestants were slaughtered by Irish Catholics, and that was used as propaganda, as I've mentioned before, by John Pym in the lead up to the English Civil War. So Cromwell is still using this as justification for what he's done, but then he goes on to say, and that it will tend to prevent the infusion of blood for the future. So what Cromwell's saying here is that he sees his actions against these people as being justified, because he thinks that this is the only way to prevent further bloodshed in the future. That by putting down these Irish Catholics, in the long run, it will save more than he's killed in this massacre. So he doesn't see his actions as being unjustified. And he then goes on to say, which are satisfactory grounds for such action, which cannot otherwise but work remorse and regret. So he's saying that in normal terms, what he would have done if he'd have done these sort of things just on a regular day, that they would be regretful, but this isn't regular. He's saying that actually this is satisfactory grounds. He's refusing to accept that he's done anything wrong. He thinks that actually what he's done is justifiable. And again, if we think back to what we know in terms of our own knowledge for Cromwell in Ireland, if you think back to before half term, where I sent you the Word document, it was about 2 or 3 pages long, by John Morrell about Cromwell in Ireland, that we know for a fact that Cromwell did refuse to show mercy to many of the people in Drogheda, as the laws of the time did allow, because the Irish during this period wouldn't have given quarter. So when we've talked about quarter previously, quarter is the idea that you've surrendered, you've lost. So you've put your guns down, your swords down, you're sort of waving your white flag, your hands are in the air, you've surrendered. So then whether you give quarter to those people or not, normally you would do, because they've surrendered, they can't fight you anymore, but actually it was quite common in Ireland to refuse quarter. So even if a soldier had surrendered and said that they gave up and they put their weapons on the floor, you still wouldn't give them quarter, you would still execute them even though they had surrendered. That was common in Ireland during this time period. So what we know about Drogheda and Cromwell's part that he played in the massacre at Drogheda. Cromwell had ordered parliamentary forces to storm the town. He'd sent more than 6,000 troops within the town as well. They'd slaughtered all who put up resistance there. And then he also deployed a cavalry force on the outside of Drogheda to prevent any escape. So any civilians that had managed to get out of the town that tried to run away, they were also slaughtered as well. As long as Catholic priests and friars, they were killed and they were categorised as a combatant. So if you're a combatant, that means that you're an armed soldier, even though we know that the Catholic priests and friars weren't armed, they were treated as though they were. And also, if you can remember from the information that we read before half term, this also included a group of unarmed civilians who barricaded themselves inside the steeple of St. Peter's Church. Cromwell knew they were in there and he ordered his troops to set fire to the church and watched them burn alive as they shouted out, "We burn, we burn." So very, very gruesome work from Cromwell there. But again, he's saying that he has satisfactory grounds to do that because in the long run he believes that he has prevented more blood from being shed by doing what he's done. And he's done what he's done because it's acting with God's providence and because these people of Ireland are barbarous wretches who have done wrong in the past, therefore they deserve to be treated this way in the future. So again, source D doesn't support the statement because Cromwell doesn't believe that he's being excessively brutal, but again, the only reason why it doesn't support the statement is because Cromwell is very biased towards his own actions. He is justifying his actions by using the concept of providence and by also claiming that he has prevented more bloodshed in the future. Right, last one. This one is very different to the previous three, as this comes from a royalist. So this is taken from the opposite perspective of the previous three sources. So source E is from a royalist known as Sir Lewis Dives. He was a loyal subject of King Charles and he describes the events at Drogheda. So this is his account, Irish history from September 1648 to June 1650, and then he published this in 1650. So it was published relatively quickly after the events of Drogheda. What we do know about Dives, this he won't be a person, he won't be a name that you recognise because we haven't spoken about him before. But what I do know about Dives is that he did spend a couple of years living in Ireland during this time period, and he did speak to many of the people that were involved in the events of Drogheda and then recorded the experiences of the massacres. So although it's written by a royalist who will naturally be slightly biased against the actions of Cromwell, what he records is quite factual, generally tends to be quite factual. So I sort of skip the first 2 or 3 lines because that is basically just giving us an overview as to the build-up of the events of Drogheda. So he talks about how there'd been some successes, some people had come to Sir Arthur Aston's relief. He was the royalist commander at the garrison of Drogheda. Then it talks about the enemy. Obviously, the enemy in his eyes is Cromwell, so he's talking about Cromwell's forces there. But then it gets interesting at this point here. The unfortunate loss of their colonel in the third assault, being so unhappily dismayed to listen, before they had need unto the enemy offering quarter. So again, I was just talking about quarter in the previous source. They'd been offered quarter by Cromwell because their royalist commander had fallen, so Drogheda has fallen, so the Catholic soldiers that are alive still had been offered quarter so that they wouldn't be killed, and admitted them in upon these terms, thereby betraying both themselves and their fellow soldiers. So he's saying here that even though they were offered quarter and they had accepted it, that actually a lot of them were unhappy to accept it because they felt like it was a betrayal. A tradition in Ireland is to never allow for quarter. So even if you have surrendered, you almost expect to kind of fall on your own sword, that you would die fighting, that kind of thing. And he says that he betrayed both themselves and their fellow soldiers to the slaughter. For Cromwell, being master of the town and told by Jones that he had now in his hand the flower of the Irish army, this is suggesting here that Cromwell has made himself master of Drogheda, in his hand the flower of the Irish army, suggests that Cromwell's acting independently, ruling with force over the areas that he captured. He's kind of the king of the castle at this point, and that the decision lays on him. And although he had offered quarter to his enemy, he then gave order to have all that were in arms put to the sword. So even though the soldiers had been given quarter, Cromwell still ordered that they were to be executed via being put to the sword. So therefore this suggests that Cromwell did act excessively brutal in areas such as Drogheda. Wasn't just the civilian loss of life, but also the loss of life from the soldiers that had surrendered and were then put to the sword, even though they had been granted quarter. So generally, all four sources do agree with the assertion that Cromwell acted excessively brutal in Ireland, even though source B and source D is Cromwell trying to justify his actions and argue that he didn't act excessively brutally. He's only saying that to give an excuse for what he's done, and he argues that God's providence had enforced him to act the way that he did, but obviously we know that he's just trying to justify his actions to the rump who had called for him to explain himself. So generally the sources agree with the statement.